looking at getting in quotes and doing some sort of off-the-record comparisons with other local authorities and to see the margins that were in there that weren't published, and that the financial information that they weren't allowed to see from their commercial partners. I think the principle has to be just as open as possible. And it's partly our job to keep pushing on that one.
There is difficulty, isn't there? Because even though we might send the Freedom of Information Act to other government-related bodies, effectively you've got government bodies who subcontract to commercial organisations. So even in Birmingham, we've effectively, the City Council subcontract its IT provision to a company, to Capita. It's actually Capita Birmingham City Council company. And I know when Help Me Investigate was doing the stuff around the City Council website, you never quite got to the heart of what Service Birmingham did and their books, and you couldn't really ask them freedom of information questions. So, Sean, how do we solve this? Because it might be we extend the Act and we've still got organisations getting around it.
On a micro level, the particular question, obviously it will always be more complicated and more difficult to legislate for government, public sector dealing with the private sector than the public sector alone. But I think that the micro level problem will be solved by the macro level trend, which is that open data, I think, and that includes commercial data as it affects government, barring an active intervention by the new government to stop it, I think basically it's a done deal. I think that for a long time the battle was between the political arm of the government and the civil service, who were resolutely opposed to everything that it's doing. It was the very antithesis of the 200 years of British civil service tradition, all about control and concealment. In the time that I was in government, in the last couple of years of the government, you could see that change. And by the time we left government, it had changed. And the centre of gravity in the civil service had shifted. The guy, Andrew Stott, the Deputy Director in the Cabinet Office that's in charge of open data, is a proselytising zealot for it. And they now know that the game is up. And I think enough key people throughout the government and the public sector have sussed that this game is up and the tide can't be stopped. And there'll be much toing and froing around the houses with it. But I think over time, unless there was an extraordinary intervention by the government, I think it's a done deal.
Can I just add something? Yeah, I think there is an additional bonus, as it were, to that, because I think that process was underway and would be happening even if there hadn't, say, been the economic recession and the financial market troubles and so on. But what those have added to that, I think, is a much stronger sort of balance between on the one hand, do you want your embarrassing spending decisions exposed to the public versus the benefits of therefore knowing where money is not being spent as well as it could be. And, it's one of those cliches that's a staple of many Yes Minister scripts and so on, is just how hard it turns out to be for ministers who, of whichever party, come into office convinced it must be possible to save money somewhere on something, and look really hard and find it really, really difficult to find anything, which is partly why the political debate in this country is about, differences of sort of 1 or 2% overall in total spending, which is, huge amounts of heat and light, often more heat than light, about a very small chunk of spending. Because actually most of the people doing that debating don't really know very much about the details of the huge amount of government spending. And that's not a criticism of them, it's just the reality is government and the public sector is so enormous that a relatively small number of ministers and their shadows and other interested MPs in Parliament are never going to know that much about that whole behemoth. And so now there is this extra incentive that, given lots of savings have to be found, that exposing stuff, making it easier for you to run the story about the embarrassing £5 million that's being wasted, actually is a good thing, because that's then £5 million that can be saved from next year's budget.
I suppose it also allows you to run the thousands of job cuts story when the public sector shrinks. So maybe journalists have got it both ways. Yes, really. They've got because ultimately this is something that results in job cuts in the public sector, and maybe we don't have enough empathy for public sector administrators or something here, but we're eulogising something that actually will result in people losing their jobs. So there's a balance here, isn't there? I think I'm quite interested to know, Stuart, how you would, what's the balance in reporting here, a great openness that ultimately results in potentially a lack of empathy for a new government as more and more people become unemployed?
I mean, I think the bottom line is everyone is braced for enormous public sector cuts anyway, and I think most of us would regard greater openness as worth that. I mean, the fact is these cuts are coming anyway. Greater openness will just help target them better. I mean, I think there's also something in public mood about openness that we need to bear in mind on the back of the MP's expenses scandals, which is through seeing the redacted versions of the expenses. We suddenly had an idea of, it entered the public consciousness that there was a difference between what those in power said was the truth and what actually what's the full truth. And that's, any kind of FOI legislation, any kind of openness is going to have to jump across that.
Yep, just to draw one comparison with equalities legislation, that has in some ways been driven further by the courts. So I wonder if there is resistance to FOI, if in fact there might be some legal actions and court decisions that do drive openness. That's just a thought.
I mean, my background is originally as a journalist, but I've been dealing with trying not to get dealing too much with government because I'm on a local public data panel. But my experience is that whilst there are people like Andrew's fantastic in central government, I've been amazed at how there have been some senior civil servants really pushing for this to happen. But I don't think the process has changed at all. I don't think there's a move among the civil service as a whole towards open data. I think there's going to be enormous resistance in the middle ranks. I think they're absolutely obsessed with process because it allows them deniability. It means it's not their fault. I think the late was obsessed with putting stuff out to tender, which was a huge mistake. I think there's an enormous amount that needs to be done. At the moment, there are a lot of incentives to do big, slow projects that the failure only becomes apparent many years after the fact. And actually, it's not going to be on the official books anyhow. And I'm slightly concerned that the Conservatives in particular were talking about a lot more outsourcing. And outsourcing generally, over the last 5-10 years, has been a failure. And the fact, I don't think the right to data or Freedom of Data Act or whatever they have will mean a great deal unless we have it applied across the board to any data that is government data, whether it's being processed, managed or anything like. In fact, I would go as far as to say that if we don't have that, there will be an incentive for organisations, for public bodies, central and local, to put things out, to outsource things, because it will allow that data and those FOI requests not to be made public.